Okay, sorry again for the delay. Thanks for bearing with us. Ubisoft Toronto's Starlink Battle for Atlas used procedurally generated worlds brought to life with a star system-wide simulation within which gameplay opportunities were detected and presented to the player as activities and missions. Today I'm going to show you how we did more with less, how that simulation is an opportunity machine, and why you shouldn't be scared by the size of your problems. My name's JP Schelter. For 4 years, I was the team lead AI on Starlink. And I'm really honored and pleased to be here to talk to you about Starlink. I want to quickly thank IEEE Conference on Games for their support and confidence, and Ubisoft Comms and PR. And also quickly thank Ed Hulshoff, who was the level design director on Starlink with me and partner on an earlier version of this talk. And thanks to all of you for sticking with me here. In Starlink, the player is a pilot, and they're a member of a research and exploration initiative from the Earth, which has discovered that a distant star system is teeming with native life, rich in resources, and has a rich history of attracting alien intelligences. Now, this star system is currently threatened by an ancient army of robots, which has recently and inexplicably reawakened. The player's mission is to explore the star system, learn its secrets, and unite the inhabitants to defeat this forgotten legion. Starlink's a new IP. We developed it from the ground up at Ubisoft Toronto. And starting back in the summer of 2013, as we were wrapping development on Splinter Cell Blacklist, a small team, which was codenamed Tomcat, began prototyping some new game ideas. And nobody really knew what it was going to come of this. But one idea that the team kept coming back to was this idea of toys, which were modular, which you could connect together and connect to a controller, and the player would be able to see that exact ship in the game. And it was something that we found really compelling. Now, a typical Ubisoft game has 3 pillars to its game design, which we use throughout development to guide our decisions. And so that modular starship breakthrough was our first pillar. And we wanted to make sure that the gameplay in the game supported it well. So our idea was that we would have creative combat, which meant that the challenges in the world would encourage the player to adapt their play style and change their ship and change the parts that they had to overcome the challenges. And we also wanted the freedom and the depths of those first 2 pillars to be reflected in an open world. But more than an open world, Starlink takes place in Atlas, which is actually a star system in the Pleiades cluster. And our vision of Atlas had 7 planets that were inhabitable. And each planet has its own biome. It has its own characteristics and dangers. And the inhabitants would have their own goals, and they would occupy these planets organically. Now, I'm not going to talk about, go into details about how we created those worlds, but rather I'm going to talk about what happens on their surface. But first, a quick outline of the talk. So I'm going to talk about prototyping a little bit, the prototyping that led to this game, and then talk about how we made a simulation that brought these worlds to life, and how we added variety to the worlds, and then how we made sense of that simulation for the player and supported player narratives. And I'll give you some takeaways at the end, some of my takeaways. So the first question that I try to tackle when approaching a new problem is, how big is it? Because size does matter. But size is relative. It really depends on your point of view. We had this really big ambition for the game, but we had a relatively small team. Now, we're Ubisoft, so when I say relatively small, a typical open-world game that we make has something like 5 to 10 times the number of people we had. We had 100 people at the maximum. So we had to be, we needed to be creative, and we had to consider our capacity really carefully as we solved problems. For instance, space is big. If you've read Douglas Adams, it's really hugely, mind-bogglingly big. Our Atlas star system isn't actually realistically big. We reduce the size so the player doesn't grow old traveling from planet to planet, but it's still 8 million cubic kilometers. Now, planets are also big. The Earth is something like 6,300 kilometers in radius. It's big enough that if you ignore certain facts, it's possible to pretend that planet is flat. Now, after looking at how we would create these worlds, at our capacity, and also how densely packed we wanted them to be with interesting experiences, we settled on a size of about 160 square kilometers of playable area per planet. And that's still pretty huge, especially compared to other open world games. But in addition, we wanted the player to have this feeling of space exploration that we had from the science fiction of our childhood. And so the planets needed to be completely circumnavigable. You need to be able to travel around them without any loading, to be able to take off from those planets at any point in time and fly to whatever you saw in space. So the planets needed to be spheres. Now, if you do the math quickly, that means that our planets are only 3.5 kilometers in radius. They're actually quite small. We can't pretend that they're flat. So what we end up doing is, in a shader, we flatten the world so that it appears to be flat to the player. If we didn't do this, things would just pop up on the horizon. And what that means is that the planets end up being looking not like spheres, but more like crumpets or scones, I guess. But that flattening gives us brings a bunch of problems. Like, things that the player perceives as being flat are actually curved in the world, and the direction that gravity is in changes really quickly as you move across the planet. And so physics needs to take care of that, needs to take that into account. Now, with flattening, the horizon is about 1 kilometer away, and the player travels. That's a pretty far distance for this kind of game, but the player travels over 100 meters a second, so that's only 10 seconds away. So we needed to stream in these worlds as the player travels, but we want the inhabitants of these worlds to continue living out their lives wherever they are in the star system, wherever the player is in the star system. So we began investigating how we would simulate the worlds. Now, we did a lot of brainstorming and a lot of prototyping early in development. And we prototyped a lot of the aspects of the game. The toys, the world building, how we would create these worlds with procedural content generation, ship control, and moment-to-moment gameplay, all these things. But one of the most compelling prototypes we created was this simulation prototype that I'm going to show you, which was created by Matt Rose, who is our producer. And he wanted to illustrate an idea for how we could populate these worlds. So you see in this video a lot of the elements that we had in the final game. The world itself is rich in resources, and there are prey and predator fauna that use those resources and depend on them. And then there are 3 factions in the world with varied motivations and varied behaviors. And there's an aggressive adversary, which is consuming the planet's resources. Now, in this simple simulation, we saw a lot of opportunities for the player to engage. And we started discussing how the simulation itself could identify those opportunities for the player. As I said, it was a compelling prototype for us, and it fit really well with the plan to procedurally generate the worlds from authored ingredients, not at runtime, but at development time. And then we would simulate the inhabitants on them. So I'm going to spoil the surprise here a bit and tell you what our simulation looked like in the end. The simulation is always loaded. It's always running. And it's actually our save game. Whenever anything changes in the world, it changes in the simulation, and that's what we save. So it's really important for this simulation to be updated, to be kept updated, and it also needs to be very efficient. So the sim is actually an asynchronous thread. It's, the setup is analogous to an authoritative server in a client-server setup, where the simulation is a server and the client is the game that the player sees. And on an Xbox One or PS4, that sim has a core mostly to itself. And we end up updating sim units dynamically so that we don't update too many of them, and we know which ones are updating, because we want the area closest to the player to be updated very quickly, but we don't want to starve the rest of the star system. We end up updating about 5,000 sim units per frame. And these sim units can actually affect their own update rate. So some of them know that they don't need to update if they have no children or if they're attached to something. In that case, they just nap until the situation changes, until the simulation tells them the situation has changed. So it takes us about 200 milliseconds to update an entire planet. And the entire star system takes about 2 seconds. And even on the Switch, where we have a lot less processor time for the simulation, we can still update the worlds with reasonable latency, where reasonable is like the player doesn't notice. I want to go back quickly to the prototype for the simulation. So I said the worlds of Atlas are rich in these resources and the fauna. And there's a group called the Expedition, which are dedicated to exploring and studying the worlds of Atlas. They defend the fauna if they find them under attack. There are prospectors, which represent the settled peoples of Atlas. They've staked their claim, and they defend their homes to their dying breath. Outlaws are criminals who are gleefully pursuing thievery and violence, and the prospectors are actually acting like sheriffs in an Old West sort of way. And then there's the Forgotten Legion that I mentioned. This robotic army which is threatening to strip all of the resources and destroy or kill all the inhabitants of the world. And so into this situation, the player arrives as a member of this Starlink Alliance, and they try to build an alliance with the prospectors and with the Expedition and find a way to defeat the Legion. I'm going to dig a bit into the units in the Legion as an example for how we created these simulations. Now, we referenced insect models for the Legion, rather. So each unit had this very specialized role in the ecosystem. In space, there were these derelict ships called dreadnoughts, which have recently reawakened, and they've started dropping primes onto planets. And these primes are like insect queens. They're massive robots that roam about the planet looking for resource veins. And they build extractor structures whenever they find one of these resource veins. So the extractor sits on the vein, and it gathers resources and provides it to the Legion. There's something called a probe, which is a scout, and it's created by the extractor, and it travels about the world, alerting the Legion to distant threats. And it also steals valuable resources. So the player, if it encounters one, can actually take those resources back, or it can follow the probe back to the Legion and learn about where the enemies are in the world. Now, the soldier in the Legion hierarchy is called the Cyclops, and the extractor will send out squads of these if probes come back with information about enemies in the world. And then there's a worker called the Imp, and its main function in the ecosystem is actually to build imp hives, which advance the Legion's occupation of the planet, another structure in the world. Now, I mentioned there were 100,000 sim units in the world. Well, a sim unit, every squad in the world, every individual agent, every structure, every point of interest in the world, every building site is what we call a sim unit. These are all individual units that control their own behavior. And they're defined in config files like this one for the extractor, which you can't really see, but that's okay. The configuration file specifies how the unit will be represented when it's realized. In this case, this extractor has a structure, it has some weak points, and it also has a behavior. And these are the things that will only be spawned when the player approaches it. It has a set of facts about the extractor, or about the sim unit, what faction it's a part of, how big it is, how much health it has, how fast it moves. In this case, it doesn't. And it also defines what logic this sim unit runs in the simulation. So the extractor has two different kinds of logic that it runs in the simulation. It has one for its own behavior, and one for for managing the units that it controls, for giving them orders. So this one has a very simple behavior tree. All it does is it waits for attacks, and then it sets itself a goal to destroy the attacker. And if it's simulated, it carries out that attack. Its control graph is a whole lot more complicated because it's responsible for managing the level of Legion infection in the area, for maintaining its squads of probes and guards, raiding parties, for handling deliveries, and also for ordering its squads around. Now, the squads and the NPCs in the world don't actually have a control graph because they're not ordering other units around generally. They just have a much more complicated behavior tree. The behavior tree, given an order from its parent structure, outpost, or extractor, handles the order, selects some goals for the unit, and those goals are actually the main point of communication between the sim behavior and the realized behavior that the player sees. So the simulation sets the goal, and if the player approaches it, then the goal is carried out by a much more complicated behavior. And the simulation will handle that goal itself if it's just being simulated. And of course, if it doesn't have a goal, or if it's finished its last goal, it'll set some goals for itself. I mentioned the imp hives. So imp hives actually add a new dimension to the ecosystem for us. They allow us to control the level of infection on a planet, the level of conflict. Because extractors, as I said, are built at these resource veins, and the resource veins are scattered by our procedural content generation to be as far as possible from each other, and also as far as possible from other points of interest, so that we can have interesting encounters there that don't spill over onto areas that would complicate the combat. But the imps build their imp hives at the same locations that the player would build a base, or that one of their allied factions would build a base. So this actually creates sort of a Risk-like or StarCraft-like game of occupation of space for the player to engage in. So in this way, we created the archetypes for our structures and our NPCs for all the factions, and we built the simulated behaviors for them. We made a set of sim unit types, something like 24, with simple interactions, because we wanted to keep the simulation efficient, and we also wanted to make it predictable and controllable. But the player needs to see variety, needs to see a lot of variety to be immersed in this world. We were selling it as an actual set of worlds in a star system. They needed to be living worlds. So a big part of game development is identifying the clever tricks and the smoke and mirrors that you use to immerse the player. So recognizing the scale of our challenge, our strategy was to always be as efficient as possible, to do more with less. We started by identifying the commonalities between the units we wanted to create. And then we would build an archetype first. So we would build one unit and make it polished and be very happy with its behavior in the simulation, its behavior when the player confronts it. And only when that was good, we would go on to specialize that unit to make variants of it that had specializations. Because when you do this kind of reuse, you run the risk of making your systems very fragile. Adding a new unit, which depends on other ones which are already made, gives you the problem of regressions that we just heard about. So you need to be very careful when you do this, and the later you do it, the better. So what does that look like in practice? We had two very different concerns when we built these units. First, we had to think about how they would fit into the ecosystem, what their roles were, what their goals were, and what their abilities were, what actions they could take. But we also had to think about how they would challenge the player in moment-to-moment gameplay, and also how they would interact with other NPCs when the player was present. So the Cyclops is the basic Legion combat unit. It's relatively slow-moving. It has medium-range weapons, and they can be found in groups of 3 or 4 in a raiding party or in a guard squad. And they're pretty evenly matched against your allies, but the player can take on a squad. Even a fairly unskilled player can take on a squad fairly easily. So once we build this archetype for the Cyclops, we started tinkering with it and looking at how we could make variants of it differently challenging for the player. So we started by a very simple change that we're familiar with. We added a shield, and we gave it some simple behavior for hiding behind the shield when it was being attacked. And what this does is it forces the player to be more precise in targeting, to be more skilled in their control of their own ship so that they can place themselves better, or to change tactics, to change weapons to something that can get through the shield. And then to double down on our idea of creative combat and to support the other pillars, the modular starships and the creative combat, we made elemental variants. And so there was an ice variant. When the player starts the game, they're given 3 different weapons in their starter pack. They have an ice weapon, they have a fire weapon, and they have a Gatling gun. And the ice weapon is less effective against an ice Cyclops, but a fire weapon would be more effective. So then we made a fire Cyclops, which has the reverse property. And we made a crush Cyclops when you can also acquire crush weapons, and so they're more resistant to those. And if you combine 2 weapons, you combine ice and fire against the crush Cyclops, you actually do extra damage because you'll get a thermal shock on them. So this is our key to supporting the creative combat idea. I talked a bit about the imp's role in the ecosystem, in the simulation rather. In combat, they're popcorn, we call them. They're easy to defeat on their own, but they're highly mobile and they're aggressive, and so they force the player to move around a lot. One-on-one, they're easy to take care of, but a group of them may encourage you to switch to weapons like a flamethrower that has an area of effect, or to switch tactics entirely and take flight to deal with them. And as with the Cyclops, we made variants of the imp, and each variant challenges the player slightly differently and encourages them to switch weapons when they encounter them. And we can make groups that are combinations of them so that the player has to learn what there is in the world to identify things correctly to be able to tackle them. So we use this same tactic to build a wide variety of adversaries, not just in the Legion that I'm showing here, but in the Outlaws as well. And we use these variants to populate all of the worlds appropriately. So we had a hot planet on which you find more fire enemies. We have a cold planet on which you find more cold enemies. And in the planets that are meant to be more challenging, you would find groups of enemies that would challenge you to decide what weapons you needed to use and to switch your weapons as quickly as possible. So another example of our do more with less approach, you can see in the fauna that we put on the planets of Atlas. Narrative called for there to be an astonishing variety of life on Atlas, which is a scary thing to hear as the content developers. And these are some of the concepts that they came up with. And we ended up taking from those concepts a final set of creatures that was based in part on how similar the skeletons were. So you see here bipeds and quadrupeds, and the bipeds actually have similar structure, and the quadrupeds have a couple skeleton types. And we developed the behavior for them in parallel. So we created a single fauna archetype for all the worlds, and we differentiated very late in development. The simple behavior would let them wander and eat and rest and roar and flee when they're attacked. And then we categorized the fauna as being skittish. These ones would just run away whenever they saw anything hostile. Passive ones, which would run away if they were attacked. Neutral ones would be given an attack and they would attack back when attacked. And aggressive ones attack anything hostile on sight. And we assigned the types to different planets so that some planets could be more challenging than others. And we created a small number of attacks. So a charge attack for a few of them that made sense for, a 360 attack to knock back attackers so that they could make space and run away for the skittish ones, and then some shatter attacks for big fauna that it made sense for them to damage the ground, and shoot attacks. So these are ranged attacks for the more hostile fauna. And we made all these attacks unique with tuning, with animation, and with VFX to give the player the sense of this variety. The behaviors for these fauna are very similar. This is a behavior tree, and it's not important that you read it. But all the fauna reuse a single non-combat behavior. And we tweak some of the inputs to them. So some of them will wander further, some of them will look for different resources, but they all use this same behavior. So the skittish fauna, neutral fauna, we added a behavior for fighting back, but the base behavior is the same. And the more aggressive fauna, we added a second combat behavior that was more complicated, where they consider finding emplacements and moving around targets which they're fighting. So, given this simulated world with a whole lot of opportunities for gameplay in it, the challenge for us was how to distill this into an interesting to the player experience. With the simulation running, the player could explore the star system and see all these units living out their lives, following their dreams. And the player could engage with them. The player could actually interact with the simulation and affect the results of it. And it was amazing for us to see, at this point, all the scenarios emerging from the simulation. And our ambition was for the player to perceive all these as well, to understand what they were seeing and to know how to interact with them. So as a prototype, we created sort of a messaging system that allowed the player to hear an SOS call whenever any allied unit was under attack. When we turned it on, we found that we had tens of thousands of units going about their lives in the simulation and getting into trouble. And we had dozens of simultaneous messages from these units all crying out for help. So we needed a way to filter all the opportunities and present only what was relevant to the player. There was so much going on in the simulation that we often referred to the process of presenting opportunities as surfacing, because the simulation was like a vast ocean and we were just bubbling things to the top. So we created a rule evaluation system, which is based on rules that happen in the game or in the simulation, and they're detected by the game. For instance, whenever an order is given to a unit, or whenever a unit sets a goal, or whenever the player enters the planet's atmosphere, or one unit enters range of another, those are all events that can trigger, and each of these events is packed with facts about the event, about the participants, and also facts about the world globally, so which planet the player is on currently, for instance. And then we evaluate these criteria with facts. And I mean, the facts can be things like, is one of the units in combat? Are the units simulated? Are they allied factions? That sort of thing. Those are the criteria. And we make up a rule with multiple criteria. And when one of these events occurs, all the rules that are associated with that event are evaluated. And the most specific rule associated with that event is the one that passes. And that rule can trigger a payload. So for instance, we can set up a rule that triggers when the player enters range of an expedition worker who has been disabled. And when that rule triggers, it releases what we call a payload. And the payload can be UI, it can be just a pop-up, it can be dialogue, it can be an opportunity, a mission, or it can be loot if the event is that the player has succeeded in doing something. So for instance, in this case, the payload that we would have fired would be an opportunity for the player to repair that unit, knowledge about the unit, and a bark from them, some dialogue saying, help, help, I'm disabled, come save me. So that gave us this system for making sense of the state of the simulation and for presenting useful and specific information to the player and for encouraging them to interact with the simulation. And we called these opportunities activities. These are interesting situations that happen immediately in front of the player. So in this example, the player comes upon a squad of enemies, and an activity surfaces for them to destroy those enemies. There was a pop-up there, the enemies are highlighted, and having destroyed these enemies, another event fires, which means the player gets some loot for completing that activity. But now while that's going on, the system also detects that a nearby worker has been disabled by these enemies and presents the opportunity that we just talked about to go and repair them. And so if the player goes and repairs them, an event will fire, which is this unit was repaired. And because the player did the repairing, they'll get some experience for it, and the unit will thank them for their assistance. So, in addition to these chance interactions that the player would just stumble upon, we wanted the player to be able to request opportunities whenever they wanted. The outposts in the world they represent allies or groups of allies or potential allies. And similar to the Legion extractor that we talked about earlier, outposts are structures, they're buildings, and they have a control graph that analyzes the state of the world around them. And it responds to that state. They have goals, and they create and control other units to accomplish those goals. And so if the player comes upon them, they can actually, instead of ordering one of their own units to do something, they can ask the player to do it. So they're ideal quest givers for us. But they're more than just quest givers, because if you complete a quest for them, they'll actually ally with you, and they'll help you in your fight against the Legion. They'll change their priorities. And the player can also build these outposts as well. So it was important to us that the missions offered by these outposts made sense given the state of the world, and that the outposts would select goals and a target for the player that would present that would fulfill a pressing need for them. But not necessarily their most pressing need, because that would end up being repetitive for a player who hadn't made enough change in the simulation to change the outpost's view of the world around them. So in this example here, a mining base is sending a player to liberate a nearby ruin to better protect the outpost itself from the Legion. And in contrast to activities, missions actually send the player away from the quest giver. So they're a good way for us to teach the player about the systems in the world and to teach them about how they can interact with the simulation. Now, in this case, the player actually gets multiple benefits from completing this action. The ruin that they're visiting was in the world occupied by the Legion, and the act of liberating it rewards the player with whatever loot was there. But because they did this they liberated this ruin on the orders of an outpost. The outpost would ally with them and would reward them separately. And having allied with them, the outpost would actually provide the player with a portion of the resources that they were mining. If it was a different kind of base, there would be a different kind of reward. Now, outposts have a limited understanding of the state of the world by design, with limited concerns. But the Starlink Alliance's mothership, called the Equinox, is actually able to track everything that the player has seen, the state of everything in the simulation the player has seen. So we designed what we called Equinox missions, which expose the player to aspects of the simulation which outposts wouldn't necessarily know about or care about. For example, if a planet is overrun by the Legion, the Equinox might direct the player to destroy some extractors. But if the Legion aren't threatening on the planet, the Equinox might tell them to build their alliance up, to go and help some outposts. If they've got a strong alliance, then there's still a bunch of puzzles to solve and ruins to explore that they might not know about, or other planets to liberate. So first we had this system on a timer, and every time the player engaged with one of the systems, it would reset. But it would still end up being a little bit noisy for the player. So we gave the player the agency to request missions from the Equinox. And here the player is being directed to hack a crashed Legion starship to obtain intelligence about the activities of the Legion in the area. The player accepts the mission and then travels to a distant site, and when they get there, they learn about a new element of gameplay which they might not otherwise have found or taken advantage of. I'm just going to skip ahead here. So from simple interactions, we developed a complex system which could detect these scenarios, which allowed the player to engage and to affect the world. But that complex system brings complexity for us in development as well, because, for instance, in the sim we have a combat director, which monitors and mediates all of the actions in the simulation. And it ends up rolling the dice to resolve these actions. For realized behaviors, the actions are much more complex, and we rely on physics and animation to carry out the actions. So we had to be really careful with tuning so that the simulated behavior had the same probabilities of a given result as the behavior that the player observed, the encounter that the player observed. In this video here, there's a bug that we found early in development where the player, having accepted a mission, is unable to successfully complete it because of a tuning mismatch like this. The act of actually approaching the unit that he's trying to save brings it out of the simulation into the realized world, and it's engaging with an enemy that's far superior, that's tuned to be far superior. So we developed a lot of tools as we were developing the systems, so we can inspect the state of every sim unit, so we could check their relationships between them, and to trigger and pause and replay, inject orders and goals so that we could avoid that kind of problem. Now, with all these elements, we had a really interesting experience. We had fun gameplay. We were getting incredible feedback from playtests about the toys, about the worlds, and about the promise of this game. And the missions that the player engaged in weren't spawned in the world. They weren't placed there overwriting some part of the world. Instead, they were all found scenarios that were emerging from the simulation and were identified by the systems for the player. But there was a lot to teach the player about this complex system. And we knew that a simple tutorial wouldn't be sufficient. We couldn't just let naive players loose in the world. After all, the game was targeted at younger audiences. So to keep the player engaged and to do justice to what we'd created, we needed a larger narrative. The programming team, as you might imagine, fully embraced the idea of this systemic approach. And the systems were fairly mature before we came to the point of adding the narrative. So there was a bit of friction against this change to a more narrative-driven gameplay. And effectively, we've been creating these fully formed enemies and encounters. And we were asking narrative and LD to figure out how and when to introduce them to the player, which meant that the challenge wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to the player. They wouldn't know how to deal with them. So part of our solution was that when the player completed some action that the story was waiting for, we would raise an event from the game so the story could advance. And on the other hand, when the story advanced, it could unlock parts of the logic that units in the sim units had. So for instance, the extractor can't level up until you've actually encountered one. And then after you've encountered it, it begins to level up and it can build more complex units. And we also let them build different units as you progress through the story. And so, and that gave us a lot of mileage. The other thing we ended up doing was hiding some units. So we had situations where the player would let the simulation run and an outpost that they needed to talk to would be destroyed. So we did have to hide some units from the simulation or protect them. And as I said, reinforcements adapted to the story progression. So the linear narrative that we created used milestones to pace the story and ensure that the simulation didn't outpace the story. For instance, in Act 1, the player meets some inhabitants, defeats an extractor, and upgrades the Equinox. And now the Equinox can leave the planet, and the player's ability to fly is restored also. Then in Act 2, the player has to defeat a prime, and they have to make more alliances. And by the end of the third act, the player knows how to build bases and how to defeat a dreadnought. At this point, we've unlocked most of the simulation, and in this way the player could explore the simulation and story at their own pace. So I mentioned playtest a lot. We were continually playtesting the game. One of the things that came up in playtest was that players loved not just the ships that they got, but the pilots of those ships, which were toys also. And the linear story that we'd created adapted to the pilot that you had connected, and so it didn't really do justice to the other pilots that you could possibly acquire, which were very compelling. So we ended up creating what we call pilot stories, which were missions that were set in parts of the world which you wouldn't otherwise have explored, and which ended up rewarding the player with little vignettes of backstory about the pilots that you didn't know. And because we'd created this system for adding pilot stories, when the opportunity to integrate Star Fox with Starlink arose, we were actually really well prepared to deal with it. And so we also added in post-launch a whole lot more side stories. And all of these side stories can be pursued at whatever pace you want. You can switch between side story and main story at any point once the side story has been unlocked, once the player knows enough about the game to deal with the challenge of it. So we created the simulation of an entire star system with a variety of factions and units in it, each with their own unique motivations and abilities. And the simulation can play out differently each time the game is played. The player choices and their interactions change the results. And as they explore the worlds, they come across interesting situations, and they're presented with missions that arise from the actual state of the simulation. And in the background, there are crafted stories for the player to participate in. And these stories guide them through the game. And at the end of the main story, the simulation continues to evolve for the player to engage with. Okay, so so you've seen how our compelling concepts and our prototypes, as well as our ambitions and our constraints, drove us to create this massive open star system and to populate it with a simulation, and how we made sure that the player would see the gameplay options that were around them, all while guiding them through Atlas with stories that were integrated with that simulation. So our takeaways, what are they? So first of all, as I said at the outset, simulation is an opportunity machine. It makes opportunities for you. But it has to be embraced. It has to be really well supported. And tuning is incredibly important, as well as filtering out the noise of what goes on in the simulation so that it's interesting so that what the player sees is interesting. And it's possible to embrace that kind of simulation while also presenting a narrative, as long as you craft the narrative to take into account the progression you expect in the simulation. You also need to expect the unexpected, because these kinds of complex systems mean that a small change can have exponential effect and unintended consequences, which is good and bad. Adding a new unit can change a lot of things, but you may not have meant to change those things. There are a lot of conflicting goals in game development, and it takes careful planning to do more with less. You need to identify why the variety is needed and what kind of variety is needed, why the change is necessary. In our case, it was important for the Cyclops, for the soldier enemies, to challenge the player to change tactics, and also to challenge the player to acquire and use new weapons and parts. And so the player had to, these enemies had to be visually distinct, but they also had to have similarities so the player could understand that the challenge was similar, but there was something new about this. So they had similar skeletons and silhouettes, but we needed to highlight differences. Now, finally, perspective changes everything. So when presented with new challenges, which we initially thought were crazy, like the toys, creating a new coordinate system to cover this entire space, this entire star system, procedural content generation, seamless exploration of these planets in the star system, spherical planets and circumnavigation, all these things. When presented with these, we taught ourselves to take the time to analyze them and to uncover what the key elements were which we wanted to preserve, and how to approach the problem to preserve them. So our approach was not to say no to a new challenge, but instead to say why and what is important about it and how can we do this. So that's how we made Starlink. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. So
we're right out of time.
We will not be locked in, so we can actually have a few questions. Does anyone? We have another microphone.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned basically the limited team around 100 people.
I'm sorry?
So you mentioned in the very beginning that you had a team approximately of 100 people.
Yes.
Can you say how big the AI team was?
3 people.
3 people. Thank
Yeah,
you.
each of our teams was 3 to 5 people. So AI, LD, toys, game design.
Good. Thanks.
Yeah.
More questions? There.
Sorry, you mentioned that there was 100,000 units in the simulation.
I'm sorry?
At some point you mentioned that there was 100,000 units in the
100,000
simulation.
at the start of the game, yeah.
So is that all the creatures in the entire universe?
It's, well, in the star system, yes.
Okay.
It's every entity, every agent, NPC, and every place you could build, all of those things. And there were more of them as the game progressed. So as enemies built more, or as your allies got stronger, there would be more.
Okay, thank you.
And there was another one somewhere.
Thanks for your talk. Very interesting. So basically, the core part of the procedural content generation here is like the evolution of the different planets, colonies now, like the conflicts, like evolved and all that sort of stuff.
So procedural content generation we used offline. We used to generate the worlds. So as we were developing, every day we would run procedural content generation on what the level designers had changed during the day and generate new planets. So we would adjust the rules for where things were scattered, how high mountains were, that kind of thing, all the biomes, and run it daily. But we wanted to have a hand in it, so we didn't do procedural content generation at runtime.
All right, and okay, so I can segue to the question then. Like, what was the reason to pick what was generated statically, what was generated like automatically, and how, like, why, and would you have put like something more dynamic, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, it's partially a question of our capacity. I mean, procedural content generation at runtime is a hard problem, and it's hard to do it and craft a story around it that was created beforehand. And I mean, our audience, as I said, is a younger audience, and so we wanted to make sure that, I mean, things were interesting for kids and had a good progression of difficulty. So, I mean, there were a lot of concerns that came up for that.
Okay, so John Paul will stay here also for the next days. So if you have any more questions, you can ask him tomorrow. And thank you again.
Thank you.